Good morning, again. Good morning. I got to start with an apology, especially to some new guests we have in the back here, some first-time people. And I'm going to go off the script a bit today from things that I normally do. I'm going to talk about theology. And the problem with talking about theology is theo means God and ology means study of, just like biology is the study of life. Theology is the study of God, and it's a study. It's not in the Bible, it's a study. So I can't turn to my Bible and say, turn to Matthew chapter 4, verse 28 or something like that. I'm just going to talk to you this morning about the theology of God and come up with some ideas on the rapture. Remember last week we spoke of the rapture? And that's the next event in our end of time series is we're waiting for. We're all sitting around at home twiddling our thumbs. Well, no, not necessarily. We should be out what? Yeah, we should be out reaching people with this message that the rapture is going to happen soon. And I do believe it's going to happen soon. And there is a study of this, that fits perfectly into the Bible. If you're looking at a study in the Bible, it has to fit in the Bible, right? It has to fit in seamlessly, and it can't leave anything unanswered in the sense that it doesn't line up with something. It's got to fit into the Bible seamlessly, and that's exactly what this study does. And under the study of theology, there's another study called eschatology. So you start with theology, study of God, then you go to eschatology, and that's the study of death and the judgment and where the human soul will end up after we leave this earth, where our soul will go. And then under that is another study called Chiliasm or Chiliasm. I've heard it's pronounced both ways. I think Chiliasm is probably the correct way. Chiliasm. And what that says it wants to talk about is it's going to tell us, it's going to try to pinpoint the time of the rapture, right? Right? The time of the rapture? Of course, nobody knows the time of the rapture, do they? I mean, God says that we don't know. We can't know. But we should know what? The season, that's right, exactly. And so Chiliasm was a belief that was held by the Jews before the first century, before Jesus Christ. And it went all the way back years and years and years into the Old Testament. And the Jews believed in Chiliasm. And when the church came into effect in the first century, the early church followers and the church leaders also believed in Chiliasm. And they believed that the model that God used for creation, that he used during creation, is the same model that he's going to use for mankind. And he's only going to give us a certain amount of time to confess and repent of our sins, and then comes the rapture. So what he's not going to do is just let us sit around here forever in sin. He said, no, I've got a certain amount of time that I've set aside, and then I will have the rapture. You heard in the Bible, too, where he calls the time of the Gentiles. God says that I'm waiting for the time of the Gentiles to be fulfilled. Well, when you say time of the Gentiles, you mean you and I, right, in the New Testament. But that also means there's a certain amount of time attached to it, doesn't it? There's a certain amount of time attached to it. And the other thing that I like about it is it said we're waiting for everybody to come to the Lord. And so every time I have a baptism, I go cha-ching, one more, right? Every time we have a baptism, one more, because we're getting closer and closer and closer to fulfilling that time. So that's where we are today. And after last week's message that I gave here, a couple of people actually asked me, remember I said how bad the world was getting? Remember how different it was 40 years ago to how it is today? And somebody said, do you ever think it'll return to the way it was 40 years ago? And I don't think that. I think the answer is no. I don't think it's the bottle of immorality and the bottle of sin and the bottle of wokeism and the bottle of everything else has been opened and poured out, and the cap's been thrown away. And I don't think you can put it back together. Andy and Mayberry, my three sons, Gilligan's Island, they've all left. They're gone. Those days are gone. You'll never see those days again. Sexual perversion is on the rise. Crime is on the rise. Drug is on the rise. And everything eventually is being poured out. Everything evil seems to be being poured out on mankind today, doesn't it? Yeah. It does. It does. And it's not a political statement to say that, because I don't think any president can take care of it. No party, no president can take care of it. The only thing that somebody can do is perhaps rein it in a bit, but it's out of control. When you have 2 or 3 generations, now we're in the 2nd generation of children being brought up in this stuff. We have kids now in college who are just getting out of college, have known this since they were babies and been brought up into it, and it's not going to change. And there, like I said last week, there are leaders to come. And so I think we're stuck where we are. And then eventually, though, the wrath of God will fall down upon these people, won't it? It'll fall down on their necks for their foolishness, and he'll destroy them. But before he does do that, he'll bring you and I home. I'm thoroughly convinced. There's a pre-trib rapture, a mid-trib rapture, and a post-trib rapture theory. In other words, are we raptured before the tribulation? Are we raptured in the middle of the tribulation? Or are we raptured in the end of the tribulation? I believe it's before. Because no father or no husband, God is our Father and Jesus is our husband. No father or husband would want us to go through that. And so I firmly believe in a pre-trib rapture. So the local question is, when will it be? When will it happen? And like I said, nobody knows. But we are told that we should know the season. And Mark spends a lot of time in this, in the parable. Remember the parable of the fig tree? You find it in Mark 13, starts in verse 28. And it says, "Now learn this parable from the fig tree. When its branch has already become tender and puts forth leaves, you know that summer is near. So you also, when you see these things happening, know that it is where? Right at the door." Now, it's not only near, it's right at the door. Now, what's the parable of the fig tree all about? Remember Jesus wilted. Remember Matthew 21:18? Says, "Early in the morning, as Jesus was on his way back to the city, he was hungry. And seeing a fig tree by the road, he went up to it, but found nothing on it except leaves. And then he said, 'May you never bear fruit again.' And immediately the tree withered." The tree was Jerusalem. Jesus came to earth on that first time he came, in his first appearance on earth. He came to save who? The Jews. He didn't come to save the Gentiles. He came to serve the Jews. And when he walked by the tree, when he saw the Jews, he saw no what? No fruit on them. And so he said, "May you be withered." But what has happened lately? In 1948, the people of Jerusalem came home. They were given their homeland, and the tree is budded. The tree budded in 1948. So when it says, when you see these things happen, know that it is near at the door. The tree has been budded again. So, they're finally returned to their homeland after years of being dormant. So the answer to the question, when will Christ rapture his church? Let's go back 2,000 years ago and take a look at it. And let's talk about this Chiliasm, which was believed by both, like I said, the Jews in the Old Testament and the church, the new church in the New Testament. And it was also believed by the apostles and some other folks, some more writers, some great men that we heard in the Bible. And the model used for creation, they say, is the same model that he's going to use again for dealing with mankind and their sin. And it says, it comes from the Greek word, Chiliasm comes from the Greek word that means 1,000. So it's like a millennial, 1,000 years is what they're talking about. And so the followers of Chiliasm and the believers of Chiliasm said that God created the heavens and the earth in 6 days and then rested on the 7th. Remember that? And that's kind of what we're doing here, isn't it? It's the same model we follow today. We get up every morning and we go to work for 6 days, and, unless you're retired, and then you guys work 12 days a week, I guess, the way I hear. But you get up 6 days a week and you go to church. No, you don't. I do. You go to you go to work. I come to fun. I love it. And then you rest on the 7th, and that's what we're doing today. And so Chilias believed that God will use the same model to deal with mankind and sin. This is where it comes from, this millennialism mentality in this Chiliasm, that God will only wait 6,000 years to deal with mankind. Then he'll come and reign on earth for 1,000 years. It won't be God this time. We understand the Chilias believed it was God, but now we understand it's not God, it's who? It's his son, Jesus Christ, in the flesh. So Chilias believed that God will only strive with sin and mankind for 6,000 years. Then he will come and rapture his church, and there will be a 7-year tribulation time period, tribulation to begin with, then great tribulation, and then he will reign for 1,000 years on earth. They also believe in quite a few things that we believe in too. They believe that the Jews would form a single body with a single inheritance, and their inheritance was given to them by Abraham. Remember Abraham? Remember the promise he gave the Jews that you will have all of this land, all of this will be yours from the Nile to this river and up here. And they've never had that. But during this time they will receive that inheritance. They also believe that they would receive a restored Jerusalem. And we're seeing that now, don't we? The temple is being restored as we speak right now. And they would live with Jesus for 1,000 years, and we believe that too. And third, they believe that the 1,000-year period would come after. I know this is a lot of theology, and I know I'm probably boring you, so if you got to yawn, that's okay. But try to keep your eyes open. You can yawn with your eyes open, that'd be great. They believe in this 1,000-year period, but they thought it was the 70th week of Daniel's 70 weeks in the Bible. And if you haven't read that, we'll get to that someday. But we know this 70th week of Daniel's prophecy of 70 weeks. We know this week as the week of the tribulation, is what I'm trying to say. And so we're all aligned. We're aligned with the Jews and their beliefs, and they're aligned with what we believe to this day. And the last thing is that during this 1,000-year period, God would reign physically on the earth. And that's important, that God would reign physically on the earth in the form of Jesus Christ in flesh. And that's another thing that we believe in that's true, and we have to remember that because I'll talk to you about this in a little bit now. So, following that period, God will reign for 1,000 years, and there are many similarities and things that have in common with Chiliasm. As a matter of fact, there was an old-time church father called Papias. Have you ever heard of him, or Papias or Papias, who studied under the Apostle John, and he heard Jesus Christ teach. So he studied under the Apostle John, and he even heard Jesus Christ teach, like many of the church fathers, early church fathers of that time did. And this belief then made it into the New Testament. This is where it came from, because the early apostles believed in this. And it was accepted by the early Christians, and it remained a popular belief in the church until, when do you think it changed? 300 AD. What happened in 300 AD? The church aligned itself with Rome. Do you remember that? The church aligned itself with Rome in 300 AD, and it fell out of favor because the church at that time and the church fathers, for the most part, believed in Chiliasm, but who didn't? The Romans. The Romans did not believe in this at all because they didn't believe that they felt that the flesh was corruptible. And if the flesh is corruptible, there was no way that Jesus was going to come back to earth and reign in the flesh, because no God would do that. If he did, he's a false God and he's a corrupted God. And so the Romans believed in that, and they didn't believe that he would return to earth and reign on earth. And this is about the same time that, what was his name? Constantine. This is about the same time that Constantine became a Christian, if you will, believed in the Christian faith and turned into a Christian. And because the Romans, though, hated the idea of a body being resurrected in the flesh so much that the church just stopped practicing it. They stopped preaching it. And finally, they gave it up altogether. And it declined in the Roman Catholic Church until finally they started to even teach a false doctrine. And they said the 1,000 years reign of Christ was going to be a spiritual reign and not a physical reign. You see what's happening? They hated they changed the Bible because it was one thought that the Romans had, that God could not return to earth in the flesh, because no God could live in the flesh, and if he did, he'd be a false God. And there's a man named Eusebius. Have you ever heard of him? I have a couple of books of his, and they're in print today. You can still buy them. And he was an early church father, but he was polluted with these Roman ideas. He was a Roman thinker and an early Christian church father back in that time, 300 AD. And he had some pretty disparaging words they had to say about Papias. And Papias said that there will be a 1,000-year period in which Christ will dwell on the earth in the flesh and reign in Jerusalem as king. And so he said that Papias got these ideas through a misunderstanding. Now you have to remember, he listened to God preach, right? And he trained under, Papias trained under the apostles. And so Eusebius says, well, wait a minute, he doesn't get it, he's got it wrong. He's made a mistake. He doesn't perceive that the things of the apostles were speaking of was really mystically, you see. They weren't speaking physically, they were speaking in spiritual terms, they were speaking mystically. And he appears to be very, I like this, I love what he says here. He appears to be very limited in his understanding, as one can clearly see by his disclosures. Well, his disclosures come from Jesus Christ himself and from the apostles, and so I don't know how you can make a misunderstanding there. So let me translate this. It's basically, he says, even though you've studied under John the Apostle, and even though you heard Jesus preach, you still believe in such nonsense, is basically what the church was saying. So today we have a reliable record of that found where? In the Bible, thank God. We have a record of this found in the Bible, and that's in the book of, in the 15th chapter of Corinthians. If you ever go to the 15th chapter of Corinthians, the whole chapter deals with the Greek philosophical assumptions that Christ will return only as a spirit and not in the flesh. And so all through that 15th chapter of 1 Corinthians, he spoke of this and talked about how damaging this was and how dangerous it was. And he wanted to set the Corinthians aside from their new belief in this Roman idea. The Corinthians were turning into Romans, so to speak, and starting to believe some of the stuff that was happening. And that was in the first century. So anyway, that's Chiliasm. And if we're going to look at it, it has to do what? It has to blend with the Bible. Like I said, it has to be a seamless blend. So let's be able to see if we can find any contradictions. And actually, you can't find any contradictions, because wherever you look, you generally find an answer to a question that you've had for a long time. Here's one I've had. Found in the book of Psalms. It says this. Psalms 94 says this. You've heard this before. For 1,000 years in your sight are like yesterday when it is past, like a watch in the night. And then if we look at 2 Peter 3:8, we hear, but beloved, be not ignorant. If you got your Bibles with you, underline, if you do write in your Bibles like I do, underline the words, be not ignorant. It's important. 2 Peter 3:8, but beloved, be not ignorant of this one thing, that one day is with the Lord as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years as one day. Now, why would Peter start his verse in the New Testament by repeating something that was in the Old Testament, but say that, be not ignorant? Because when Peter was writing his book, this is what was happening. The church was ignorant of this fact, that one day to the Lord was 1,000 years, and 1,000 years was like one day. So he said, be not ignorant. Put aside these false beliefs that you picked up over the centuries and drop them, because they're not true. He says, for 1,000 years in your sight are like yesterday when it is past, like a watch in the night. So in other words, it's just 1,000 years to you. It's just like one day that passed in the watch of the night. So that speaks of God, and it speaks of 1,000 years as a day. But the church at that time was believing in amillennialism. Have you heard of that? The belief that Jesus Christ will not physically reign on earth for 1,000 years. And the church was beginning to believe that. And the 1,000 years, they didn't believe of the 1,000 years mentioned in the book of Revelations in chapter 20. So Peter was reminding them of their first belief in a physical resurrection. So let's take an example from the beginning of time, and let's see what we can fit into this and see what happens here. Remember when God told Adam and Eve, what did he tell them on the day they ate of the fruit, what would happen? Yeah, you'll die. He actually said, on the day you eat of the fruit of the tree of good and knowledge, you shall surely die. Right? But there's a problem with that. And I've always had a problem with that. For years I wondered, well, why didn't they die? He said, on the day you eat of it, you will surely die. And I was told, for a lot of folks, that he meant spiritual death. He meant spiritual death. And that could very well be. That could very well be. But what about physical death? Because everywhere in the Bible, you look with that exact same word, death means death. It means separation. It means being separated from your body and things like this. And so maybe there was both a spiritual death and a physical death on the same day. And listen to this. First off, they were separated from each other. Right? Death caused separation, so they were separated from each other. They were separated from their innocence. Next, they were separated from God because they hid themselves and clothed themselves. They didn't want to be in his sight. They were separated from the garden. Then they were separated from the environment. So the only problem that we have with this verse is they didn't die physically. And death in the Bible, again, when it says this same word, it means a physical death. It means it's both a spiritual death and a physical death. So, Chiliasm, though, allows us to take this verse literally. That they did die on that very same day that they were born, in fact. How old was Adam when he died? 930 years old. How old was Methuselah when he died? 969 years old. If a day is like 1,000 years to God and 1,000 years like a day, then they did die that day. They died on the day that they were born. I mean, what's that? You add another 31 years to Methuselah, he could have been 1,001. What's the big deal for 31 more years on top of that, right? Was his knees bothering him or something? Or, were knees killing him? I don't know. But I know he did die on the same day that God said he would die. Another thing that the first century church had with Chiliasm, and it was a hatred of all things Jewish. And as Christianity spread, many Christians began to feel superior over the Jews. Have you ever studied that and heard about that? They felt superior over the Jews. Why? Because they didn't kill Christ. You killed Christ. We didn't kill Christ. So the Gentiles are more Christ-like than you because you killed Christ, and that's not right. And also by 300 AD, the church was was fleeing from all things Jewish as fast as it could. By the time that Constantine was in the Roman church was started, by that time the church was just getting away from everything Jewish, and they just held the fact that the Gentiles' churches were more superior. So here we are in 2024, and a few people have never even heard of this study of Chiliasm. But in the meantime, while all of this was happening, and throughout the years, there were men who looked for the age or the date of creation. Have you ever heard of a man called Bishop Ussher? Bishop Ussher? Him and a lot of other fellows throughout time have gone back in the Bible to find out when was the earth and the universe created. And so he said if man is only going to strive, if God is only going to strive with God for 6,000 years, it better be a good time to figure out where we are on that 6,000-year timeline, where we stand. And we find answers in the genealogy of Christ. Have you read through the genealogies in the Bible of Christ? The book of Matthew starts with the genealogy of Christ, and it goes all the way back from Abraham to Joseph. And the book of Matthew was written for Jews by a Jew, right? Written for Jews by a Jew. And in the book of Matthew, he wanted to establish two things. He wanted to establish the fact that Jesus Christ had the authority to be the king, and he also had wanted to establish the right that he had the right to be the king, that he had the birthright to be the king. So he had the authority to be the king and the birthright of the king. And then in the second genealogy of Christ, it's in the book of Luke, chapter 3, it follows Christ from Adam all the way forward to his mother Mary. And so this is where the birthright came in. And so through Abraham, it gave him the right to be king, and through his mother Mary, it gave him the birthright. So we both had birthright, as far as the Jews were concerned, to reign as king. Remember the book of Genesis chapter 5, that's the begats section. Ever remember that? So-and-so was so-and-so when he begat so-and-so, and then he died, and then so-and-so begat so-and-so, and then he died. And when you go all the way through that, all of those begats in the book, you find out when Noah walked the earth. And so a man named Ussher, Bishop Ussher, took these dates that he found in the Bible and put them all together, and he came up with a date that said 4004 BC. And if you look in that Bible, that old Bible back there, that's Bob's Bible, Bob Wass's Bible. And if you open it up to the first page in Genesis, be very careful. And it says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And published on the side, it says 4004 BC. And I have another Bible of mine that was written at the same time around the 1800s at home, and that says the same thing. Now, you might believe the earth is 1 billion years old, and that's fine. But biblically, this is the number that we come up with biblically. And so we're just going to stay in biblical terms right now. And so he found out that according to the Bible, the earth and the universe was created in 4004 BC. But by the time he came up with that date, Chiliasm was dead. It was long gone. That happened generations in the 16th century that he came up with that. And by then, people had just forgotten about Chiliasm and forgotten about the 1,000-year millennial reign of Christ. And then right after the 16th century, things got really, really strange because they came up with a new theory called the year-day theory. And for some reason, they took the 1,260 days that were mentioned in the book of Revelation, and they added that to the days, I don't know, the Constantine's conversion, because he was the Greek conversion, and that was in 312 AD, and so they took that, and they came up with a date for 1572 for the rapture. So they all waited patiently for the whole year during 1572 with no rapture. And then after that, they kept making up dates. Date after date after date after date after date, the church would make up dates until it got to the point where people just didn't listen to the church at all. It had lost all of its authority on that subject. And so it's been silent. That's why it's been silent now for these last, it's 2024, so the last 400 or 500 years, you haven't heard a thing hardly about any of this. Dispensationalism was another problem too, because they said that Christ would reign on earth for 1,000 years. I know this is a lesson, and I'll bring this all together next week. So pinch yourself, because you need to know this so that next week you'll understand what I'm talking about. And it says that the inheritance of the promise of Abraham will happen, but it says this came in at the same time, but not to the Jews. You see. And so that was another thing that came into the church. We'll have this age period, this will happen, but not the Jews. And so that was Israel, they said, was God's earthly people, and Christians were God's spiritual people. Okay? So that's the study. And it's so messed up with so many different generations have gone by. When I teach the book of Revelation, which I'll probably do again sometime because a couple of people have asked me, when I teach the book of Revelations, the first thing I tell them is there are 7 different interpretations to the book of Revelation. 7. So you know how messed up we can be, mankind can be, to come up with 7 different interpretations for the book of Revelation. So how many interpretations do we have of the book as a whole? So that's the lesson. I'm sorry to kind of bore you, but I think next week you'll really enjoy the fact that we can look at this and maybe time out this timeline and get an idea of where we are. And I think it's very, very important because, as you will see, it fits into the time that we are in right now perfectly. It really does fit into what's going on in our world today. And we'll talk a little bit about this. But I think when we're done, you'll probably want to go home and do what I do, start praying for the rapture to happen, because it may not be that far away. And I'll give you a lot of different hints about time and what the Chiliasts believe. It's not in this book because we can't know the exact date, but they did say we can know the season, right? So thank you.